Well, happy Mother's Day again. Thank you guys for taking your time to be here this morning, and appreciate Rhonda and Carmen having the moment to honor moms like that. A couple of quick things. Memorial Day weekend, we have one service, all right, on Sunday, one service at 10. That just happens to be when everybody decides that they want to be anywhere but indoors. Kind of gets crazy, which we all understand, so we take a little bit of a break there. And then also this week, if you haven't already decided to come, you should try to make it to the Roy Hall Leadership Conference this Thursday. Jim Tressel will be there, and it's a great opportunity to grow in leadership. And it's not just for those that might be technically the leader of their department or their company or whatever, but everyone is a leader. Roy and I were talking about this. You have to lead at least one person, and that's you. And actually, that's the most important person you lead. So if you think I'm not a leader because I don't lead other people, and you don't know that you have to lead you, you're a leader. And that might be like kind of step one to seeing some new things happen in your life once you actually, instead of just maybe following you lead you. And so anyone can come to this. This is professional development for all different kind of stages and levels, wherever you are in an organization or in your career or in your life. You can make yourself grow in leadership. And when leaders get better, everybody wins. Because when the leaders and the people that are taking people somewhere, take them to the better somewheres, they end up in better places. I just made that up, but it sounded pretty good. I have one of those jobs that's just kind of interesting job, it's a very visible job, right? It's visible. It's something that, here I am standing up here, the lights, the cameras, you're all facing, listening. Church has that kind of interesting dichotomy of something being visible, but it's not really a job. Like my job is not to be visual in a sense that to look a certain specific way to try to get whatever it is message across. My job is to actually understand that it's visible and to be appropriate for the moment to try to get whatever message that I believe God has communicated to you. That's it, right? Like I'm here to bring my heart and my soul to the message that God has revealed in his word. And so, I have to be visible and audible in order to do that. But I have a job that is visible. And so some people think it's a visual job. And what happens is this time of year, something really annoying always happens. People come up to me all the time and ask me if I go tanning. And the other day, I literally, someone came up to me. Someone came up to me at the pickleball courts, and that's why I'm dark, okay? If I cut the grass, like the first time I cut the grass and being outside, I get dark like that. It's just part of my heritage. I get dark super fast, right? You can ask my whole family. It's just part of who I am. But someone came up to me at the pickleball courts, and when they were like, so when do you go to Venezuela? And I was like, never. They were like, oh, everybody says that you go to Venezuela all summer. I'm like, who's everybody? Who says that? Who is saying, has anyone heard that rumor? You have? No, you haven't. You have? You are making that up. I do not go to Venezuela. I've never even been to Venezuela. But so in my role, I don't think there's anything wrong, if you go tanning, if that's your thing or whatever. But for me, sometimes people might think I'm tanning to make my job what it's not, right? Or it can make my job what it's not, a visual job as opposed to a visible job, right? My job is not to get tan so that y'all like my tan. I don't know, whatever people might think I might go tanning for. Do you go tanning, some type of aesthetically kind of engaging, he goes, I don't know. Because if I do that to me, then, that takes away from the sincerity of what I'm saying. Because, anytime you kind of are putting it on And it goes, like, oh, you're adding that. Is that real? Is the question, it's in the subconscious. Are they real? Are they being real? Is that real? Sometimes anytime you're a certain type of personality, like for me, I'm a little bit larger than life, passionate, and people might go, is that real? Is that really who he is? And you get to know me, and that is kind of how Joel is. I'm demonstrative and passionate and zealous, and that's who I am. But when you're up in front, people can wonder, is that real? Is it sincere? And sincerity is so important. In fact, it's the driving piece we're going to look at through the life of Peter for the next 2 weeks. The life of Peter and sincerity, and what it means to be sincere, what it means to present yourself without wax. And we'll talk about what that means, to actually present the truth, the real deal as it is. And we're going to look at sincerity, and we're going to look at the life of Peter and see how these two interplay and see what it has to do. What you guys just, with us and with God, what you guys just read is you read arguably the most famous story of the life of Peter throughout the New Testament. Where he is on this journey. It's a long journey. Jesus takes him to this place that if you study it, I've never been there, Caesarea Philippi is one of the most beautiful places in that region. It's just absolutely breathtaking, waterfalls, hills. It's something to behold. And there's a temple made to Augustus, who was called the Son of God. And so it's an interesting place to have this conversation. Jesus takes him to this place where there's a temple to the Son of God, who's the son of Caesar, the Son of God. And he says, who do you say that I am? And then when Peter says, Son of God, there's a connection he's trying to make. Do we see me like they see this guy that is represented in this temple? Or do we see me like, the guy that made this waterfall and this whole beautiful world? How do people see me? And that's part of the interaction that they're having. But what you're watching is you're watching Peter, who is the leader of the 12 closest followers of Jesus. He's the leader. He's the head guy. So Jesus had lots of followers, right? Apprentices, people that wanted to be like him, follow him. He had some that were, hundreds of people. They would kind of follow him regionally. He had some 50 that would kind of get a little closer. Then he has his 12 that he really set apart and would say specific things to that he wouldn't say to other people to. And then of the 12, he had the 3, and they're called the sons of thunder because they get to go to the transfiguration and the lightning and the thunder, and James, Peter, and John. And they're kind of part of one of the most amazing revelations in the New Testament. And so they get called that. And then Peter is set apart even from them. He is the leader of all of them. And in the story, he's kind of like the foil. If you study narrative, right? He's the foil. He's the one whom is put up against the protagonist to try to pull out the characteristics of the protagonist, to kind of show you his qualities, against the contrast of someone who's kind of a mess, kind of stumbles and fumbles through life. So Peter is the foil in this kind of narrative. He's that close to Jesus, and he kind of makes who Jesus is and his character pop out. But he's not just the foil. At the same time as being the foil, he's a representative of the followers. He's the one who goes on to become the founder of the church. He's the one who is the leader of the 12. He's the guy. Like, this moment where they have this interaction is fascinating. It's a fascinating interaction. 40 years after the ascension of Christ is when these New Testament pieces on average were written. And what we find is that the authors of the gospel accounts, they are so poignant. It's almost like overwhelming when you look at it from a literary perspective. They want every single one of the readers of these gospel accounts of the life of Jesus to look at Peter. They want them to notice Simon Peter way more than anybody else. Simon's name, Peter, his name and stories are in there 5 times more than the second most name, John, who's in there 20 times. 120 times the authors pull out Peter, who he is, who he's like, what he's like, his life. Simon Peter is all about that. His name is mentioned that many times. Now, when you see this story, when we look at the one we just saw, it is such a spectrum that it reveals. It shows such a wide range of the nature of this guy that we're looking at, right? Here you see a guy who's the leader of the people that Jesus is called to be his followers, and he goes on to become, the cornerstone, the first pastor of the church. And he's that guy, and he says this thing when Jesus asks him the question, who do people say that I am? He says, you're the Messiah. Now, Messiah it's a Jewish word, right? You know it, maybe it's the Christ. That's the same word as Christ, or the anointed one. And the anointed Christ was the person who was supposed to be the warrior, king, priest, deliverer for the nation of Israel. So basically, all throughout the Old Testament, the nation of Israel is waiting for Messiah, is waiting for the anointed one. And there's all these kings who are anointed with oil to be the leader of the nation of Israel. And, they don't get the leader that they're looking for. They're looking for the true deliverer to get them out of oppression. So when they anoint David as king, that happens so long, but then David ends up dying and they go into oppression, and then they go into exile after that. So he couldn't be the Messiah who's talked about, but we need a Messiah still at the time of Christ, because now we're oppressed by the people of Rome. Our life is horrible. So we need a Messiah. So Jesus says, who do people say that I am? Some people think you're a prophet. Who do you say that I am? And he says, you're that guy. You are the Messiah, warrior, anointed king of Israel. And Jesus makes a whole spectacle out of it. He stops and goes, that what you just said is one of the most profound, infinite, spiritual, divine realities that could ever be articulated by a human, that there's no way that you figured that out on your own. In fact, Peter, in this moment, I declare that God revealed himself to you so that you would say that. Now, if you have ever, been around church culture or pastors that people say are anointed or whatever that is, and I'm not saying, I believe that I'm chosen by God, and you too, we'll talk about that, but that they're God's man for whatever specific thing. You think that's a pretty remarkable, demarcation. That's a pretty significant deal to be like the guy. Jesus says that Peter is that guy. You're that guy. That is a huge moment. And then 3 sentences later, he says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. He calls him Satan. He calls him Satan. It's like, you just said that he had the most profound engagement revelation that's ever been said to a man, and now 3 sentences later, you're telling him to get behind you? What in the world is this about? How can you have someone that has that much of a dichotomy? Here you have the guy who Jesus says has the keys to unlock the gates of the kingdom of God. Now he's referred to as Satan. Now, Jesus isn't saying that Peter is literally Satan or that Satan is in him or something like that. What he's doing is Jesus is picking up on the sentiment that the actual accuser, Satan, left him with when Jesus was tempted in the desert. So before Jesus started this public ministry, he kind of went through a picture of what Israel went through by going into the desert for 40 days. They went through for 40 years. And he gets in there and he gets tempted by the devil. And the last temptation is he shows him all of, the kingdoms of the world. And he says, you can have all this if you worship me. So what happens is Satan is saying, you can be the king without dying on a cross. You can be the king without, sacrifice. All you have to do is lay down your life. So what Peter is doing is picking up on the same sentiment. Jesus has just said, I have to go face the elders and die. And Peter goes, no, you don't. You're the Messiah. You don't have to be the king. You can be a king a different way. You can be a king without having to go to the cross. You can be our king without having to go through sacrifice. Same sentiment that Satan put out there. So he's wanting him to be that. This is classic Peter. You have, the guy who is the divine oracle portal of God, and now he is reiterating something that Satan said. Now, let me ask you a question. You want to spend some time with that guy? If you knew that whole thing, would you be like, now that's a dude I'd like to kick it around with? Now, some of you dudes might be like, yeah, bro, let's go. But really, if you heard, you just kind of be like, that's off. Like, what, huh? Like, he's like God's man and he's talking about Satan, huh? Like something about you might go, I would listen to him. I like him, but I'm not going on a road trip with him, right? The guy who 1 minute looks like a hero of the faith, and then this next section of his conversation with Jesus is the centerpiece of failure. Peter is impetuous. Peter speaks before he thinks. He's ready, fire, aim. Peter is jumping out of boats, chopping off ears, setting up tents instead of worshiping. And N.T. Wright, my favorite theologian, he says that when Jesus actually calls Peter or Simon the rock, we'll talk about that, he changes his name, that it's actually more like calling your dumb friend genius, or like heavy-set buddy Slim. Okay, Slim. Peter's erratic. Have you ever wondered why? Like, why is he like this? Why is he this kind of mixed bag of emotions and interactions and intensities, and why does this happen? And it's tough to learn everything we can about Simon, but there's some history that can show us some insights into why Simon, who gets his name changed to Peter, is the way he is. So the first one is this, that he's a bad listener. He doesn't listen, right? Now, there's reasons that he doesn't listen, but let's just start with he doesn't listen. Look at the story that just happened, that we just read. What does Jesus say? I need to go, face the elders, be tried, crucified, and then he says, and then I'm gonna raise, So what happens is Peter, he hears Jesus say that he's gonna be crucified, and that's it, he's done listening. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody where they say something and it strikes you emotionally so intensely that then from everything out you don't hear? It's like, no, you weren't. I said you weren't. You started talking before I finished. Like, that's not the whole thing. Jesus says, I'm gonna die and then I'm gonna raise, but all Peter talks about is how he said he's gonna die. He's not a good listener. And so when you're not a good listener, why? Why are you reacting so much? It's kind of an interesting thing. Simon, his name, his birth name, is a transliterated version of basically the word Shema, which is a famous prayer in the Jewish history and in Deuteronomy. The Shema is, hear, O Israel, or listen, O Israel. The Lord our God is one. So it means listener. Ironically, listening, not his strong suit, not a good listener. The other thing is, another piece we start to dig in is he has a trigger finger. Why does he have a trigger finger? We'll look. Simon is the guy who, if you know the story, he's the one who, after the Last Supper, which is like this incredible moment, right? It's a moment full of gravity. It's the most important meal of the Jewish holiday cycle. They come together. Jesus doesn't just let it be Passover. He turns it into a new covenant of a promise of his blood and his body and this death he's about to go live. And he says to them, go do this with each other. He washes their feet. Now you should treat each other that way. This is a remarkably intimate moment. And then they sing as they're leaving, they're celebrating. They go to a garden to pray. It's a prayer moment. God tells them to pray, and then of course they fall asleep for an hour. This is the one time Jesus calls Peter Simon again after he's changed his name to Peter. He says, Simon, Simon, couldn't you sleep? Couldn't you stay awake for 1 hour? Kind of like, this is the old you. I thought we'd moved on. Name changing, meaning something about the nature of your future. And so Simon is the guy that then in that moment, he grabs a sword when the guys come to arrest Jesus in the middle of the night, and he chops off a dude's ear. And Jesus says, stop, put the sword back. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Now, interestingly enough, the name Simon, which is his birth name, was a common name during the time of Jesus, because there was a revolution, the Maccabean revolution, that happened a couple hundred years before the time of Christ. And it was led by the Maccabean father. and he led this revolution to overthrow the Seleucids, the Greeks. They wanted to come in to Jerusalem and impose Greek culture on the Jews. They actually did what's called the abomination of desolation. The worst possible thing that could happen in the Jewish temple happened under Antiochus Epiphanes, this oppressor. He brings a pig into the temple and sacrifices a pig to the false god Zeus. That is the worst possible thing that happened. This is the holy place of Yahweh, and we're bringing an unclean animal in, and we are sacrificing him to a God that is not the true God. That's like tear your clothes, the worst day in the history of the Jewish people, arguably. And what happens is there's a revolt that's led, and after the revolt is won, Simon, the Maccabee, he becomes the holy new king priest of Israel. And so what happened is centuries later, lots of parents were naming their son Simon, hoping that they might become the warrior deliverer. And so now you start to see the sword-grabbing, trigger-finger warrior who wants to deliver. Interestingly enough, Jesus changes his name, as we've referenced. And Jesus changes his name to a name that fits not who he is, but who he will be one day. Another thing we learned through kind of some of the studies of the life of Peter is that Peter was probably fatherless. I wrote fatherless meathead. It's interesting because what happens is in history, these guys have their naming conventions, and there's naming conventions that take place throughout history. And Simon was named Simon, son of Jonah, or Simon bar Jonah. And it's kind of interesting to think about a father who his name is Jonah, who's a fisherman, named after, the guy who spent 3 days in the belly of a fish. But here we have Peter at some point losing his father, but then staying a fisherman. And so you have this kind of fatherless guy who his dad was, named after a fisherman. He's named after being a good listener. And he's named after being a warrior king. And he doesn't have his dad, so he goes into the family business and he starts fishing. And they would fish in the way that you and I might think of now as with a drag net. They wouldn't use like a line. They'd have like 2 40-foot boats, and then they'd put a 30-yard net in between the two of them, and the two boats would row, and they'd drag the net through the water all night long because the fish couldn't see the net during the night. And so they would try to fish that way. And what would happen is you can imagine something that long and that heavy with water, even if it didn't catch fish, being heavy. So a lot of the guys that worked as fishermen, they had specific roles. And you can imagine that some of the guys that were a little stronger would be the ones responsible for pulling up the nets. So we learn from the scriptures that Peter was one of the guys that was responsible for pulling up the nets. So it's believed that he kind of had this nickname as having these bulging biceps and was probably called the Rock, and some of his buddies called him that before Dwayne Johnson. He was the Rock. And what happens is Jesus actually, in him having an encounter before he ends up following him, he goes down, Peter goes down 5 days walk to go meet John the Baptist or hear John the Baptist preach in Jordan or at the Jordan River, which is 5 days away. I mean, he's kind of this guy that he's got a job to do, but he's gonna go find this revolutionary John the Baptist. He goes down there, and instead of just listening to John the Baptist sees Jesus for the first time. And that's where John the Baptist points out, Jesus, hey, there he is, the guy that takes away the sin of the world. Well, Peter is there watching that happening. And at a certain point in the near future, Jesus asks to borrow Peter's boat, and he says, you're not gonna be Simon. We're gonna call you the Rock. And you can see it, right? Could it be that Jesus knew that this was Simon who had lost his father, who was a kind of a meathead, hardworking fisherman that God saw so much more potential in than he did? So it's almost like if you have a group of friends and you have a nickname for somebody, somehow Jesus found out about him not having a father, and then actually says, no, you are the Rock. you're the rock. You're more of a rock than you know you're a rock, and I'm gonna show you how you're a rock. And he's like, yeah, I'm the rock. Could it be that he figured this out? The fatherless fisherman, the wild bull of a man from Galilee who was known for his strength and folly, the dreamer who had a spark of that deliverer in his given name, but who couldn't escape the destiny of his coastal people. And that's the last piece. Simon, the rock, Peter, has a rebel heart. He's from this region in Galilee that is known, it's called the Am Haaretz, which means people of the land. And in this region of Galilee, where the poor, the uneducated, the lower class, and kind of the grunt workers, a lot of the Gentiles would be there, and a lot of the Jews who lived there didn't observe the law. They didn't observe it. Interestingly enough, that region that Peter is from in Galilee is 5 days walk from Jerusalem and 5 days walk the other way from Nazareth. So for Jesus to go to Galilee, which is where he did most of his public ministry, and he started his ministry and gathered his followers, was common, right? A lot of different rebellions would start from this area. It was these people who were frustrated with being oppressed, and they were hardworking, and they were viewed as less than. Well, Jesus goes right to that space. He specifically goes. He has to walk 5 days to go to Galilee to meet a guy like Peter and to say, you're the rock, and there's more. There's more for you. Simon, the bad listener, trigger finger, fatherless meathead with a rebel heart. Could it be that Simon really represents everyone? The inconsistent, emotionally unstable, fatherless fisherman is who Jesus sees becoming a pillar of character and a key holder for the kingdom of heaven to come to earth. Peter never totally becomes this picture of the great man that we think he should become. Noble and consistent and willing to die for his beliefs. He does, but he's never perfect. If you read in Acts chapter 15, even after Jesus leaves, Peter messes up again. He starts to make Gentiles follow Jewish rules to become Christians, and Paul has to leave his ministry efforts a long way away to come back to Jerusalem and to confront Peter and the church. And he says, you can't do that. And Peter's like, I was with Jesus. And Paul's like, I don't care, you're wrong. He never fully becomes all that he's supposed to become. Peter was a fisherman who became a fisher of men. But Peter, he caught the hearts of people by telling them real stories of failure, not typical fish tales. And this is where I think it gets really, really interesting. Usually after somebody dies, we don't roast them. If you guys saw the roast that happened this week, that a lot of people were talking about the roast of Tom Brady. And it's like, it's awful what they say. They just get so seedy and gross, and the whole thing gets out of control. But you don't do that when someone passes away. That's not what you do. You don't do a roast. Now, there might be some characters go, I want you to roast me, and we all do it. But really what you do when someone passes away is you kind of diminish the negative and you pull out the positive. You don't want to sit around and talk about the worst days of their life. You try to remember the good, and you try to talk about that. It's believed that all the stories about Peter find themselves in the New Testament because of this reason. All the failures, all the missteps, because after Jesus left for 30 years, it was Peter who went around telling the stories of his failures. He was known for when he would talk to people, he would say, let me tell you what happened. And he wouldn't have a revisionist history and talk about, when he talked to Jesus and say, and I said, you're the Messiah. And he was like, God just told you that. See, I'm God's man. Did anything else happen after that? No, not that I remember. He would say, I said to Jesus, I believed he was the Messiah. And Jesus said that was a supernatural revelation. But then literally like four sentences later, I was arguing with Jesus and he called me Satan. And everyone's listening to the story of the gospel of Jesus on earth. And Peter's telling this story. He made sure that people knew that he had failures. He tells the story of walking on water. But he doesn't just leave it at that. Yeah, I walked on water. I mean, wouldn't you? I walked on water. You walked on water. That's a fact. I walked on water. But that's not the whole story. The whole story is he takes his eyes off Jesus. He starts to sink into the ground and Jesus has to lift him up. The story is really that you started to walk on water, but then you lost hope and you lost sight and you lost it. You started to sink. Peter made sure you heard that he sunk. Peter wants to be remembered, not just for his victories, but for his failures. He wants us to see his flaws. He wanted us to know who he was and who he can become. I think it's because of who you are and who I am and who we can become. Can you relate to this? Peter understood a very profound truth about people and connection. We impress people with our strengths, but we connect through our failures. Despite Peter's efforts, this is what's fascinating. I think it's remarkable. Despite Peter's efforts to make sure that the darkest moments of his past remained present in the readers' minds as they read the New Testament, he is still revered and was revered. According to Christian tradition, Peter was crucified in Rome under Emperor Nero. The ancient Christian churches all venerate Peter as a major saint and as the founder of the church of Antioch and the church of Rome. Many of us today, we know at least one church that's named after St. Peter. There's one in Worthington. My grandpa was a part of the eldership that built that church, St. Peter. And if you go to Europe, especially Rome, you can't walk a mile without running into a statue of Peter. In the center of Rome is Vatican City and is St. Peter's Cathedral, which is the largest cathedral in the world next to the incompleted La Sagrada Familia in Spain. The largest cathedral in the world, named after St. Peter. When you walk in to St. Peter's Cathedral, there's a giant statue of Paul and a giant statue of Peter, the founders of the church. During construction of St. Peter's Cathedral, which is hard to explain, obviously the building is magnificent, but there are statues everywhere. Every inch is a masterpiece. Everywhere you go. There's nothing like it in the United States, not even close. It's absolutely remarkable. And every single statue is a work of art. It is just mind-blowing. But during the time, there was an interesting process when they were making these statues that they would go through, and who some call folklore, but is still believed to be true. You know that these sculptures, they're made out of rock, granite, stone. A great artist would take a very large piece of stone and pull one sculpture out of it, keeping the stone from cracking or from breaking apart was one of the challenges and the abilities a very truly talented artist would be able to do. During the Renaissance, art was reborn. That's what Renaissance means, the rebirth. And many desired to be hired for their work. Some would often go desperate and they would start to lie to prove their skill with rock. It is believed that some, who would later be called khans, would make sculptures that had many fractures, and they would fill the cracks with wax to try to hide the imperfections. Eventually, people would test for this. Cere, the Latin for wax, and sin means without. This is where the term sincere comes from, meaning without wax. When a sculpture was without wax, it meant the real deal. No flaws. This rock is strong. This rock is sincere. Peter is called the rock. There is no doubt he had flaws and fractures. I think he wants us to see the power of his humanness and how Jesus picked him with his flaws, but that he ended up sincere. When I was young, our family went through a divorce. My parents got divorced and our family was fractured. I mean, it hurt us all in all different types of ways. It fractured me. I feel it. I see it. I still experience it. And those closest to me, they see it. And the truth is that God didn't let me get filled with wax to cover my flaws, but he is in the process of genuinely healing them back to their original constitution. Now, sometimes I put wax on them. And sometimes that's what we do. We have our broken past. We have our inconsistencies of character. We have what we know as a sin nature. And we don't want people to see those things. So, sometimes it's just easier, isn't it, to just cover them with wax instead of having them whole again. And when you're talking about rock, that was the thing about the process of making something sincere. Man, if you make a crack, you could get all the way down to the very end and then it's cracked and you can't make it be uncracked. You can't put the stone back together. So there's something about a crack in our lives or a fracture that feels permanent. It's, oh no, there it is. I'm done. There's no hope. And I know because of mine, sometimes I am insincere. And I have to share with you just genuinely that in ways I always feel slightly unfulfilled in my life. I just want to share that with you. Like, I have moments where because of the fractures, and it's not just what happened in my family, but my choices and my life, and as I go through this reality like you all are, there are times where I feel tremendous growth and I feel tremendous connection and intimacy with God. But I don't think that there ever comes a time where just all of a sudden, all the fractures, all the stuff just totally goes away and I'm just totally fine. I always feel it. It hurts. I feel it all the time, It's a reality for me. Fractures. When you think about Peter not having a father, this can cause a wounding, which is so spiritual, it's so painful. But I do believe this with all my heart. God is my artist, and I am his workmanship. God is my artist, and I am his workmanship. The key for all of us to healing is when we are willing to point out our fractures to the Master in prayer. Every time I bring my flaws and my failures to him, he does something supernatural. You guys, part of growth and part of healing is not willfulness alone, it's willingness. The willingness to go to God and say, I'm broken right here. This is a problem. I need you. And you can help me. Please do. And he can. And I've experienced moments in my life where genuine fractures, things that I thought were permanent, things that I thought would never go away, where God just heals them and they go away and you just go, how can you do that with stone? That's because I'm God's. That's because he's the workman. That's because he's the artist. When Peter writes his letters in the New Testament, he uses the imagery about Christians being stones, but he adds a very interesting twist. He doesn't just say that we're stones, he calls us living stones. What is a living stone? Could this be his way of saying, Jesus called me the rock way before I was? And his spirit will do for you what it did for me. You might think that your past, your problems, your faults, failures, and fractures are set in stone, but not with Jesus. He can heal you. He can prop up your broken character. He made the rocks, and he can reshape you. You don't have to be fake. In Christ, you can become new. He might say something like, believe me. It happened to me. It's happening to me. It can happen for you. Sincerely, Simon. I don't like the phrase God uses broken people. I'm not mad at you if you say that, and I understand your meaning, but I don't like it. I actually despise it. God uses broken people. God doesn't use people. That's not what God does. God is not just up to some thing that's so big, and then you are his means to an end. You are the end. He's up to you. He's up to you. It's not, I'm using you to be up to my other thing. It's I'm up to making you into who you were supposed to be so we can be who we are. It's a different emphasis. And broken people, that's an unnecessary qualification. It's just people. And people are beautifully, fearfully, wonderfully made, and we all have flaws and fractures. And here's the reality. God chooses everybody. He did that on the cross. And while we were sinners, Christ died for us. All of us. He says, I choose you, I pick you, I'm here for you. The offer is for you. I choose you no matter what, with your flaws, with your failures. I choose you. The only thing that has any variable is whether or not we choose him. That's it. Will you choose God? Will you choose him? Will you step close to him? Will you take yourself to him? Will you put your art, you in the master's hand? Will you do that? Because here's what happens when you choose Jesus. One of two things. This happens, one, the other, or both all the time. Human flourishing. You choose God and he shows you what life is all about and you live it. And or peace that passes understanding. Sometimes you get both. Sometimes you don't get a flourishing life. You always get peace when you choose God. He will transform your heart.